Hi, everybody. I'm Justin Toppins, and I want to welcome you back to the Sheol podcast. I know we've been absent for a couple weeks, and I apologize for that, but we're back with some really great episodes over the next few weeks, and we're going to start with an interview that we had with Stephen Hawley Martin. Stephen has a background in advertising, and he is now the editor and publisher of the Oaklea Press. Stephen himself has had 2 out-of-body experiences. Those experiences changed Stephen and encouraged him to begin writing. He has written books such as A Life After Death, Powerful Evidence You Will Never Die, and his latest book is called The 3 Keys to Lasting Happiness and How to Obtain Them. I had the privilege of talking to Stephen about a variety of topics, including his new book, and I hope you guys really enjoy Stephen's interview. So without further ado, let's get to it. Everybody, we want to welcome Stephen Hawley Martin to the Sheol podcast today. Stephen, thank you for taking the time to be with us. We really appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Justin. I'm looking forward to our chat.
All right, so I know that you have, you're a prolific author. You have several books that have some really interesting concepts I think our listeners would really appreciate hearing more about. But before we get into that, I just want to kind of get you to provide your background to our listeners.
Oh, sure. Well, I spent most of my adult life, my career was in the advertising business. I was principal of an advertising agency that created the GEICO Gecko and Virginia's for Lovers, probably the 2 campaigns best known for. But I really love, my passion is writing, and I have been writing books for a long time. I started while I was still very much in the advertising business, and I used to get up early every morning, write for an hour, and then go to the office and write about geckos and things like that. But I grew up in a very traditional household, not a very religious household. I mean, we went to church maybe on Easter and Christmas Eve or something like that, but it was more tradition than religion. And so I had a unique experience when I was in my 20s that started me on this path toward investigating metaphysics, and that's what a lot of my books are about, probably the ones you want to talk about anyway. So that kind of gives you a little overview.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, you certainly had a lot of success in the arena of marketing. Do you mind sharing some, or what you're comfortable sharing of that experience with the listeners?
I'll be happy to, yeah. I've had really 2 experiences that were very much what led me to this wanting to share what I have since learned about the nature of reality. But the first one happened when I was about 25 years old. I lived in Baltimore, Maryland. I was not married yet. I lived in an apartment in an old part of Baltimore called Bolton Hill that with 2 other bachelors. We had a fairly large apartment and with an upstairs and a downstairs. And I was very sick one weekend. I had a terrible case of the flu. And when you're 25 years old, you don't want to be in bed on a Saturday night, nursing the flu, but that's what the case was. And I heard some people coming in downstairs, and after a while more people came in, and I could tell that there was a party going on down there. And here I was up there, with the flu, and just felt awful, but maybe I'll just get up, put on some clothes, go down there, maybe it'll make me feel better. So that's what I did. I put on some clothes, I went downstairs, I had a few drinks. I have to admit that there were some people smoking some funny cigarettes, and I took a puff of one of those, and I just started feeling horrible. I mean, terrible. And I wasn't sure I could even make it back upstairs, but I managed to practically crawl back up the stairs and flop down on the bed. And it was like things were spinning around. I felt like I was going to throw up, but I couldn't get off the bed. I was just so immobilized. And then suddenly I kind of felt my chest expand, and like something popped, and suddenly everything was calm. And I kind of gathered my wits, and I sort of looked around, and when I did, I saw my body on the bed looking like roadkill. I mean, it was like, and it took me a minute to recognize myself. You don't usually see yourself that way. You're used to looking at yourself in a mirror, and this, but I figured out it was me down there, and it came to me. I had always thought up until that point, because I was brought up in a household that was very scientifically minded, and the idea of, I guess you'd say my parents were scientific materialists, and which means they believed if you couldn't see it under a microscope, it didn't exist. It had to be material substance. Matter was all there is. And I looked down there, and I realized that actually my mind became very clear up there. It had been very muddled, obviously, with the flu and the alcohol and whatever else, and but it was very clear. And I realized, hey, I'm not my body. I'm here. My body's down there. How can that be? And that really is what started me on this quest, if you want to call it that. This was not a full-blown near-death experience. Probably your listeners have heard about those, where you go through the tunnel toward the light, and you're greeted by either relatives or friends who've gone before, or maybe you're greeted by your guides or an angel, or if you're a religious person, maybe Jesus greets you. But it was none of that. All I had was this out-of-body thing where I was hovering up near the ceiling. In fact, I remember looking closely at the ceiling and seeing that it needed a paint job. But the next thing I knew after having that thought, looking at myself for a little while, was it was Sunday morning and I was waking up, and I felt a whole lot better. Then later on, after that, my mind was boggled by the fact that I realized I was not my body, I was my consciousness. And so I started looking into metaphysics, and I joined the Rosicrucian Society, which is a society of mystics that study metaphysical laws, practice metaphysical laws. It's not a religion. They say if you have a religion, that's fine. But this is not a religion. We're studying metaphysics. This is what we do. And I went through their correspondence course. I took all the courses. I became what's called an adept. The Rosicrucian Society has been around for a long time. Some of our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, were Rosicrucians. But anyway, so I learned an awful lot about metaphysics. And then I came across a book which at the time was fairly new, called Life After Life by Raymond Moody. And Raymond Moody was an intern at the University of Virginia School of Medicine who went around interviewing people who had been clinically dead and resuscitated. A lot of them, in a hospital situation where they have a heart attack or whatever, and they're dead, they're flatlined, but then they bring them back. And he wrote a book about what he learned from these people, and he is the guy who coined near-death experiences, NDEs. And I read that book in one sitting from start to finish, and that really got me going. And then a while later, I was married. I had a child. I had a very nice life and owned a house, and I was in my backyard. It was a beautiful late spring day, probably about 75 degrees, beautiful blue sky. I was on a lounge chair meditating, and I had what people usually describe as a mystical experience or an experience of mystery, where I felt as though I merged with the infinite mind, and whatever I thought about, I instantly had all the answers. And it's something I describe in one of my books, but it's something that's really very hard to describe. Anybody who's had one can tell you that, because you feel that you are have access to all knowledge, and that it's a feeling of being engulfed by love, unconditional love. I mean, it's what a lot of people experience in the full-blown near-death experience. And after that's when I really started writing books about metaphysics and life after death and reincarnation and so forth. So there you go, Justin.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And I don't want to steer too far away from the rest of our conversation, but I think it's interesting that you have the two experiences to draw on, because some of what we run into is a lot of questions about, with your first story, is there a way this could be a hallucination, right? Which is something that Bruce Grayson kind of addresses quite a bit in his research. And then you've had this second experience. Did you feel in any way that the first experience made you more open to the second experience at all?
I'm sure it did, because it opened my mind to the reality that we are not our bodies, and I am not my body. My body's like an overcoat. I sometimes, I say, it's like you had this spacesuit that you're wearing that allows you to operate in this reality. If you don't have the spacesuit on, you can't operate here. You can maybe float around and see what's going on as a spirit or a ghost or something like that, but you can't interact with anybody or anything unless you're wearing the spacesuit. And that's what I realized after a while from that first experience. The second experience is where, a lot of information came to me that I can't repeat verbatim because there was so much, but at the time it was so clear. And Bruce Grayson, of course, was like me. He was brought up in a materialist family. His father, I think, was a chemist. And of course, he was a psychiatrist who also at the University of Virginia. And in fact, Raymond Moody, who wrote that book I mentioned, was one of his colleagues. It took a while, I think, for Bruce Grayson, who didn't have the experience I had, to realize that this near-death experience thing was real and that we really aren't our bodies. And one of the things that the University of Virginia, what is it called, the Division of Perceptual Studies conclusion that they've come to, which Grayson headed for a while, is that the brain does not create consciousness. The brain is a receptor of consciousness, and it interacts with consciousness. I believe, and I think he would agree, that actually what the brain does is it's like a filter that kind of steps down consciousness. When I had that mystical experience, I went beyond my brain into what the infinite mind, and it was just mind-boggling where all this information was available. And we can't live like that in this reality. We'd be bumping into walls and stuff because we wouldn't, we need to have our consciousness step down so that we can, it's a survival mechanism, so that we can focus on things and get around and drive the car, stop at red lights and stuff like that. So anyway, I'm rambling. So what do you think, Justin?
No, I love it. I think that's a great breakdown. I wanted to ask you about that because, I've spoken with Dr. Grayson and, obviously read his book after, and that's the thing that stopped me. I was calling people while I was driving my car because I was listening to the book on tape, and the way that he explains the theory, I feel like is really good for lay people. The way he explains the filter theory, and so I'm glad you did that. I mean, I think it's a great breakdown.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you also, in your book, I read your most recent book. It's called The Three Keys to Lasting Happiness and How to Obtain Them. And we'll get into it a little bit here further down the line. That you've written a lot of books. I was really interested in your book, Life After Death, Powerful Evidence You Will Never Die. And in your most recent book, you talk about how we need to update the way that we approach science, and specifically the idea that scientific materialism is not adequate. Could you kind of explain from your perspective to our listeners why you feel that way?
Yeah, well, it's because scientific materialism is outdated. I mean, let's face it, scientific materialism, the science that's still taught in schools, has been a tremendous benefit to mankind, to the world. I mean, we've learned so many things about medicine, about we've created, all kinds of technology as a result of it. We've got labor-saving devices. We've got machines that do great things. We've got computers. All of that's great. But the fact of the matter is it's based on a false premise. The premise being that all that exists is matter. And that's not true. All that exists is energy. And that we've known really for more than 100 years. Einstein, back in the early 20th century, said, he's the guy who came up with the formula E equals mc squared, which says that matter and energy are equivalent. They're the same thing. They're in different forms. So the reason we have scientific materialism is that, and this I learned from a book I wrote about one of my ancestors, who was one of the Salem witches, Susanna North Martin. She was hanged as a witch in 1692. And
well, how did you I'm sorry to interrupt you. How did you obtain that information that you were related?
Oh, well, it's just something that's part of the family lore. I grew up with it. My mother was very, almost obsessed with it. That was one of the reasons she was anti-religious, I think, is that she, the idea that somebody could be accused of witchcraft and hanged and so forth. And Susanna was not a witch. I mean, I did a lot of research. It's great because all of the depositions, all of the trials, transcripts, all of that stuff still exists. It's online. Anybody can go do the research I did and find out all about it. And a lot of contemporary writings about the witch trials. Anyway, as a kind of backlash to that whole thing, back then, of course, people thought that there was another dimension that, Christians would call heaven, but also hell, where there were spirits, there were good ones, angels, and there were bad ones, demons. And that human beings, both men and women, there were a couple of men who were executed as well during the Salem witch hysteria, would form a contract, make a contract, form a pact with the devil, and do his bidding on earth, and in exchange for, prosperity and so forth. Well, as a backlash to that, a English philosopher named Thomas Hobbes, you probably have heard of him. He wrote the Leviathan, I think, a big book about politics and all. He said that if God created it, then that's all exists. He's talking about the physical world. God created the physical world, and that's all that exists. There is no spirit world. And intellectuals latched on to that, and that was the genesis for the Age of Enlightenment movement. Intellectuals in the 17th, he said that in the 17th century, around the witch trial time. But in the 18th century, the 1700s, intellectuals latched onto that, and it became what is called deism, where the idea that God created the universe, he was the great clockmaker, he wound it up, let it go, was no longer involved in it. And that was what a lot of people during the Age of Enlightenment thought and continue to think today. Except that along in the 19th century comes Charles Darwin, whose theory of evolution, survival of the fittest, allowed intellectuals to get rid of God altogether. And that's where we still are with the materialist idea of only matter exists and evolution and so forth and all that happened by accident. The idea of the Big Bang, which is a 20th century idea, everything came from nothing. There's a song in The Sound of Music that says nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. And I agree with that, but apparently scientists don't. They think that all the laws of the universe, all the matter of the universe and the energy came from nothing in a single instant. Well, that doesn't wash. And if you want to know why I think that, you probably need to read some of my books, but I got some pretty good arguments. And I think that idea is going away. I don't see how anybody can really hold on to it. I think that energy and consciousness, energy is the ground of being, and consciousness comes from that. Or actually consciousness, you can't get beyond consciousness. It was Descartes who said, I think, therefore I am. So you start with consciousness, and then you have energy, I guess, and then you have everything. And when you think about it, Justin, and when I was in college, I took a philosophy course, and one of the questions on the test was, if a tree falls in the woods and there's nothing around to hear it, does it make a sound? And the answer is no. If nobody's there to hear the sound, there isn't any sound. And it's the same thing with reality. You got your eyes open now. You're looking at your microphone or whatever you're looking at. If you weren't there to perceive that, if we didn't have consciousness, the material universe wouldn't exist because there'd be nobody to perceive it. So anyway, that I'm kind of getting off track here, but I have lots of reasons.
I feel like you're on script.
There's much more to reality than just matter. So
it seems like there's been a paradigm shift. That there are a lot of scientists researching in this area. I mean, seeing what Sam Parnia is doing, it seems like at least in the public forum there's more discussion about that. Because you make a really good point there. I think
you're right about that. Let me just comment, because I think you are. I've been at this for 20 years, and I have seen a big change occur. When I first published books with these ideas, I would get 1-star reviews like crazy because the scientific materialists would get on there and say, "Oh no, that can't possibly be true." Well, I think it was author Schopenhauer, the German philosopher. I guess he's also 18th, early 19th century philosopher, who said that all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is violently objected. Second, it is, it ends up in denial. I've forgotten how I phrase that. But third, it's accepted as self-evident. And that's kind of what we've been going through. First, it was violently objected 20 years ago, not that long ago, at least from my personal perspective and efforts. And, so people have kind of been warming up to the idea. And now I think it's eventually going to it definitely will get to the stage where it's so obvious to everybody that, it's why did anybody think otherwise? And that's where we're headed.
Do you think that the way that we've been able to, because obviously we've known about NDEs for centuries, but it seems like research into this topic is kind of propelling the conversation that you're talking about forward a little bit. Because I can't really think of anything else where we're, I was going to ask you, because you talked about in your book the observer phenomenon in quantum mechanics, and I think to a lot of people that is something they might read about but not quite understand or know how to apply. kind of their daily lives and their existence, you know?
Yeah, the double slit experiment, where that's the famous one, where the participating observer, where the scientist or the researcher who's conducting the research, what he knows or doesn't know determines the outcome of the experiment, which, when you stop and think about that, what he does or doesn't know, whether if he knows something, it gets one result. If he doesn't know and isn't able to know, it gets a different result. And what that says is that his mind and the rest of reality, or at least around him, is all connected. And that's what the truth is. We are all part of one mind. We think we're separate because we each have an ego that's been built up since birth. We have a job that we identify with. We have family and so forth. So we think that we're a separate entity, but at the core, at our very center, we are part of one mind. We're a facet of one mind. We just think we're separate, and that's one of the things you realize when you have the mystical experience that I had, or what a lot of NDEers have when they pass over to the other side. They realize that everything is connected and all is one, and they're part of it. And they have a past life review, for example, where they see not all the actions, everything that happened in their life, not only from their own perspective, but from the perspective of the people that they interacted with. They feel what the individual that they said something to, either good or bad, what that person felt, or what. I've had a man come up to me after one of my talks about one of my books who said that his good friend had been in an automobile accident where a guy went through a stop sign and he ran into him, and the friend had this terrible rage where he was hit by this guy, so he got out and he beat the crap out of the guy who had hit him. When he had his past life review, he not only felt what that man felt and experienced what that man experienced from that beating, but also all the people who were related to that man, his children, his wife, his children who weren't able to go to college because they didn't have money because their father couldn't work because he'd been crippled in a beating, the wife who had to go to work, all of that. So we're all one. The idea that Jesus says, what you've done to me, you did to everyone. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me, something like that. That's true because we all are one organism, one consciousness. We just think we're separate. Back to you, Jason.
Okay. All right. Let me ask you before we move on from this particular topic. I wanted to get your take, because you're very good with your explanations on some of these more difficult concepts, I think, for a lot of people to grasp. Could you talk about distance phenomenon? Because you mentioned that as well.
Yeah, well, there really is no distance. There's one mind, and in mind, there is no distance. This particular reality, this three-dimensional reality, 4 dimensions if you want to include time, is a creation. That it's Big Bang created it, I guess, if you're coming from that school. And so distance exists here where you have to move from here to there. In mind, there is no distance. That's why there was a study done by the Columbia University School of Medicine where they were testing the efficacy of prayer. And they had different prayer groups of different religions and denominations pray for women who were having in vitro procedures done in South Korea. Now, most of those people were here in the United States who were doing the praying. Some were in Australia, and distance didn't matter then, because the efficacy of the prayer was demonstrated regardless of distance. And it's because we're all part of this one mind. And in mind, there is no distance. It's everywhere at once, but it's, really not taking up any space, if that makes any sense. I don't know. It makes sense to me that that's why, you talk about the double entanglement things in quantum physics.
Yeah.
Something that's way over on one side of the universe affects something that's on the other side of the universe. It's because it's all part of one mind. Inside your head, you think your mind's inside your head, but it's not. It's everywhere at once. You just thinking it's in your head because your brain is your filter that it's coming through. You see what I mean?
I can't think of another way. That's a kind of a mind-blowing concept.
Yeah, it is. It's everywhere at once. Everything. Mind is everywhere. It's in, it's in the microphone that you're looking at. It's in the chair that you're sitting on. It's everywhere. It permeates. I think of it this way. We are characters in a dream that the source is having. I hesitate to call the source God because that conjures up some sort of anthropomorphic, human-like figure. But that's not what God is. God is the source, is the energy, is the mind that we're all part of. And we are characters in that dream. And we're all connected. And that's why synchronicity happens. That's why all kinds of, things like that. I mean, when I'm writing a book, it's just amazing how things pop up that I need right then for that book. It's like, these synchronicities, once you realize the synchronicities are real, they start happening all the time. Or what happens really is that you start noticing it. There you go.
Well, that's what you're describing isn't that it's pretty similar to the theory and the proof of God by Bernard Hayes, unless I'm misremembering.
I'm not sure I've read his, but the synchronicity is something that Carl Jung came up. I mean, I think he coined that word, where there's a famous he had a woman that he was having, what do you call it, psychoanalysis with. And she had this dream about gold beetles. And he looked around and there was something thumping on the window, and he opened it up and in came a beetle that was, I've forgotten the technical name, Latin name for the beetle, but it was like a gold beetle. And that was the synchronicity that opened up that patient's mind to the idea that that really that there's a whole lot more to reality than just our own brain. So yeah.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you about because this is, I think I could probably talk about this type of stuff all day with you. But I want to ask you about your latest book. And I've read the book. I think it's a fascinating read, by the way. And you talked about a methodology, the idea of finding out why you're here. And of course, obviously the name of the book is The 3 Keys to Lasting Happiness. So I'm sure that's a motivation for you. But from your perspective, what motivated you to write on this subject?
Well, I think that I think that all of us come into this reality, or born into this reality through our mother's womb, for reasons. We have a reason we're here. It could be different for every person. Obviously, you might be here to learn something specific. You might be here to overcome some sort of karma. You might be here to you might have a mission that you've come to execute. And I think I came for a number of reasons, and one of them was to debunk this materialist idea that I've been at it for 20-some years, no longer than that. So I think I wrote my first book about it in 1995, so almost 30 years now. And that was one of the reasons I'm here. And the other, so what I suggest in the book is that you, as the reader, have reasons, or a reason, probably more than one, that you're here. And what you need to do is figure out what that is and then pursue it. And then I give kind of a methodology about how to go about that. You need to think about why you were born to your particular parents, why you were born where you were born, why you were born at the time you were born, what you like to do as a young person. What did you spend hours doing and, just got caught up in it. One of the things that I spent hours doing was, after I got a movie camera, was creating stories with it. And I found, and I realized this before I realized what my mission was, that I love to write and I love to create stories and communications. And that's why I went into the advertising business. But the advertising business was, even though I was very successful at it, was really not that satisfying to me. And so if you're looking for lasting happiness, you need to find out a way to use that gift that you have. It's not really a gift. It's something you probably learned over many lifetimes. I call it dharma, which is your particular ability that nobody has quite like you, that you can use either to make money or to serve others. And the way you find lasting happiness is using that dharma to serve others in some way, because that's what's going to give you the sense of satisfaction and fulfillment that leads to lasting happiness. So that's kind of what the book is about. And there's 3 things, 3 keys. I won't go into them right now because it'll be a spoiler, but I hope that people will get the book and read it and find out what their dharma is and find lasting happiness, because that's why I wrote it, so they would be, they'd be able to, because our culture does not show you the way. Our culture says you ought to go out and make a lot of money and, make something of yourself, be a celebrity or whatever. That's not going to bring you happiness. There's so many people who are rich who are very unhappy. So there you go, Justin.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And I don't want to push you into any spoilers per se with your book, because obviously we want people to go out and get it. But is there anything you would say to our listeners about first steps in the process of kind of finding out why you're here and what you can be doing?
Well, yeah, I think I mentioned that, that I think you are here. Everybody's here for a reason, and sometimes more than one reason. And sometimes, and so you need to go and give that some deep thought, I guess is a good place to start. I suggest that people go to the library or someplace where they are going to be undisturbed for kind of an extended period of time and really start digging into that. What did you like to do as a child? What did you spend hours doing that you didn't even realize the time was passing? You were in the flow. Those kind of questions. In fact, I have a whole list of questions in this book that you could ask yourself. Are you happy on Monday mornings when you have to go to work? Are you doing something that you love? Those kind of questions are really the place to start. And then I give a methodology for trying to transition from wherever you are now to where you really want and would like to be. And obstacles are what you look for, and then you devise a plan to overcome those obstacles. Those are the kind of things that are in this book that I hope will help people get on the right path for lasting happiness and fulfillment. There you go, Justin.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I hope so too. Hope that our listeners are willing to check it out. We're running a little short on time.
Go to my website. It's on I've got it on my homepage of my website, which is shmartin.com. shmartin.com.
Okay, yeah. Is there anywhere else that like our listeners could find you besides the webpage?
I'll just Google my full name, Stephen Hawley Martin, with Stephen with a PH, Hawley, Hawley, Martin. You'll find out a lot about me if you do that. I've done a lot of podcasts and I've written a lot of books, and so it's all, you'll find magazine articles about me and things like that.
Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this because, I mean, I know you're busy. You just got the book coming out. I'm sure you've got some things coming up as far as promotion goes, and I appreciate you being willing to talk about the aspects of metaphysics too, because a lot of what we do on this podcast is explore cases, and so we're trying to bring more and more guests and provide insight for listeners so that they just have a little more perspective. And I really appreciate your approach and just being objective, and then with everything you've learned, kind of trying to make things better for other people as well. So we really appreciate you, Stephen, and thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Justin. I've enjoyed it. I really do. I appreciate it. And let me know when it's going to run, okay?
Absolutely. We'll be in touch with you via email. And and before we go, definitely everybody go and pick up the 3 keys to lasting happiness and how to obtain them. And I just want to one last time thank you, Stephen Hawley Martin, for being on the Sheol podcast today.
Thanks, Justin.
All right. Bye, Stephen.
Bye.
We want to thank Stephen Martin one last time